So, hello. Apparently, the chair is not here. Am I correct? Uh, Before checking for the chair, I'd like to just check whether the debaters are here. Is OG here?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Is OO here?
Yep.
Okay. Is CG here?
Yes.
Okay. Is CO here? Oh, the chair is here.
Right. Hello. I'll just do a very quick check to see if reference here. Opening up.
Yeah.
Here.
Great. Opening up.
Here.
Great. Closing up.
Here.
Fantastic. And closing up. Closing opposition. Hello. CO. Can someone from CO confirm that they're here? Joshua, Fabian. Closing off, if you're speaking, I can't hear you. That might just be because if you're on another call, Zoom sometimes cannot let your audio on. Just wanted to confirm, is it just me? Okay, yes, I can hear closing off. Great. I also assume Joe is here. All right, so hello and welcome to round two. I'll be your chair for this round. My name is Shilipto. On the panel with me is...
Hello, I'm Joe from Tokyo. And yep, thank you.
All right, could we have a round of intros for the teams? And if you could also indicate if you would like to be recorded or streamed.
In opening government, Paula speaking first. She or her, I'm fine with streaming.
Robert second, I'm fine with streaming as well.
Great, opening up.
Hi, David. Speaking first, I have no problems with being streamed.
I Riv speaking second, and I'm okay.
Cool, closing up.
I'm okay.
Sorry, could you speak up a little? Because you were like very distant.
Sorry, I'm okay with anything.
Could I also know the speaking order of CG? Because I...
Sorry, I was,
sure.
yeah, I'm Sam. I'll be the leader. I'll be the member of opposition, a member of government, and then Linh Dang-Hoang will be the government whip.
Great, thank you. Closing off.
Hi, sorry, I disconnected for a moment earlier. Can I clarify the question?
Yeah, you're just asking if you could introduce yourselves and if you could also indicate if you consent to being streamed.
Okay.
Hello?
Joshua, speaking first. Oh, sorry, am I audible?
Yes, you are. All right, I'll just assume.
Yeah, Joshua speaking first.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I think most people are fine with streaming, in which case I think the conveners are good to go. I'll very briefly walk you through just some housekeeping rules. I will attempt to time you, but do maintain your own timers. Remember to wrap up by 7:15, at which point we will stop taking note. Second, please indicate your ideal POI preference right before your speech. Having said that, conveners, are we good to go on the stream? Hello, if I can receive some sort of confirmation, that'd be great. Anyone from the convening team?
Sorry. It's totally okay. Thanks for the confirmation, everyone.
Okay, let us know when you're streaming.
No, we
Thank you. Paula is in the chat exclusively. Okay, I'll start my speech now. First, let's outframe what is out of this debate. Probably we are not talking about abuse victims, because probably abuse victims still, in the absence of this culture, would cut off people from their lives, which means that if you are abused, you're probably going to be leaving anyways. Why is this so? Because there is a rising awareness about the mental health and abuse awareness. For example, a lot of victims of abuse did not leave before because they were unaware what constitutes abuse in the first place. Like, women were thinking, my husband just loves me if he's hitting me and stuff like this. This is something that is being challenged today. But also secondarily, because we are rising facilities to help the abuse victims. We are rising, with the safe houses for women and stuff like this, which means that this is something that is probably out of the debate, and it's not under a burden to say that if you're abuse victims, you still have to have stay in an abusive relationship. Now let's characterize how this culture specifically looks like. The way that cut-off culture specifically looks like, it means that this is becoming a rising trend and more people are doing this. What does this mean specifically? It means that this is something that is glorified within our society. Like, a lot of self-help coaches and a lot of life gurus and stuff like this are recommending this as a form of self-care and stuff like this. Secondly, it is shown in popular media, and it's also exacerbated by popular influencers at top of like a power move and stuff like this. Thirdly, it is shown as a very loud and empowering act. Like, it's often constitutes with a lot of gossiping about this person that you're cutting off and stuff like this. Like, this is a toxic person, they did a lot of shit in my life, now I'm standing up for myself, now I'm cutting them off and stuff like this. Like, it's not a silent process of you just distancing yourself, you're like shitting on this person and stuff like this. Lastly, this is also a part of Western radical self-care narrative and individualism, that you should be prioritizing yourself even at the expense of other people. So like, even if someone hasn't done anything that is like objectively wrong to you, you still cut them off if you don't find them like, good for your life and stuff like this, if you find their energy draining or whatever. And we are also like expanding definitions of what is constituting a legitimate criteria for cutting out someone off of their life. Like, if they're not, like, for example, if they're having like a very bad situation with their life, so they're like not going out with you so often, you can see this as a reason to cut off a person and stuff like this. What is the counterfactual on our side of the house? Counterfactual on our side of the house, that you still cut people out sometimes, but you opt into this as a last resort, meaning that you are not cutting off people at a first red flag, but you're trying to reconcile with them. You're trying to explore what is going on, trying to make this relationship work and stuff like this, instead of abandoning them. But also secondly, you are not explicitly rejecting this person, you're just distancing yourself. There is a difference between cutting someone off and distancing yourself from someone, because cutting someone off is like you telling you are no longer worthy of my my time with you, you're no longer worthy of me hanging out with you and stuff like this, while distancing is something that can be more quiet and more subtle. Like, we are not seeing each other anymore like 2 times a week, we are just seeing each other like 2 times a month, which is still something that can be good for your mental health, while still to some extent preserving your relationship with the other person if you want to reconcile in the future again. Okay, now on to 2 arguments. Firstly, why this is something that is generally bad for the person that is cutting off others, and second argument about why this is bad for people generally who may be cut off. Okay, firstly, this is something that can be incredibly bad because people are going to do this irrationally as the consequence of this rising culture. Why is this so? Firstly, because this culture is something that is sensationalistically oriented, because like you have to talk about very like extreme stories, and you also have to talk about more niche stories in order to attract audiences. Like, if you are a YouTuber and you're cutting off a friend, you have to like tap into untapped market and talk about very like niche situation why you are cutting someone off, to like have like the first mover advantage or whatever. Secondly, people have a short-term attention span, which means that in relationships, these are very complex things, right? In relationships, like they often require a lot of work, because you are like, you have to like make 2 people who are completely different make work, and this is something that you cannot this is something that can have a lot of short-term obstacles, and on their side of the house, you're probably going to be likely to live at a short-term obstacles. This is why, because people have short attention span, and they are unable to like think for the future and think long term. Thirdly, this can also affect friendship groups as well, because like if one person decides to cut off someone, even if other people find this person still valuable, you can shame them like, okay, but this person was toxic to me, like everyone should be abandoning this person and all these kinds of things. So we believe, why is this something that is done bad? Because and also you're going to opt in this irrationally, because you're doing this most of the time when you're emotional, like when you had a fight, or when you literally like hate this person and stuff like this. Instead of stopping and thinking rationally, you're going to be cutting them off, because you're going to believe that your feelings are valuable, and then what you are thinking right now is something that is objective truth and something that is more valuable than anything else, and therefore you're going to be cutting off people. Why is this so? Because it's very hard to reconcile with people if you figure out that you have made a mistake. Why is it hard to reconcile? Because firstly, you made this person feel very bad about themselves. This is probably like something that is, a very bad and ugly process. But also secondly, because if you try to cut them off, this is going to be, if you try to reconcile again because of the cut-off culture, this is going to be shown as weakness. Like you should not be reconciling with a person that was toxic and stuff like this. Before second argument, back half POI.
After years of relationship building, do you think that friends would cut off each other due to like a moment of conflict?
Yeah, because of this culture, the thing is that you are not going to allow the relationship to mature to this kind of like level and stuff like this. And also like, yes, some relationship would like survive, but like on your side of the house, there is more broken relationship. Secondly, people who are very vulnerable, who are unpopular, ugly, shy, and not fun, they're going to feel constant fear of abandonment. Why is this so? Because like you're going to feel like they're going to abandon you because you're not like contributing to the friend group and stuff like this. If you get cut off, why is this something that is horrible for your mental health? Because humans are relational animals, which means that we are basing our worth in relation to other people. When other people tell us we are not good enough to be even in their presence, this is attacking our sense of self-worth. Why is this something that you should value, that you should be weighing massively in this debate? Because your sense of self-worth is something that is inescapable. You're constantly with your inner thoughts, and you're constantly going to believe that you are not worthy, and that you're going to feel bad about yourself, and you're not going to be able to escape it. And also it's going to be hard for you to try to meet new friend group, because you are going to feel like shit because your previous friend group has abandoned you, and you're going to think this is going to happen again. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Maybe have the Leader of Opposition make a case for the opening up.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yep, loud and clear.
Great. There are like people doing some work in the background. So like if somebody is like passing behind me, that is just my grandfather. So just like, don't be surprised, I guess, if you see someone coming through the window. It's not a ghost, I promise. Okay, I'll take PYs in chat, starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Government bench is right. People can still cut off on their side. But the problem is that without the culture, without the establishment of a criteria and good processes to cut people off, the process of cutting someone off will become much more toxic and traumatizing. 2 arguments in this speech. Number 1, why people have a systemic bias to have a hard time cutting people off. And so most people stay in toxic and draining relationships. And number 2, why the rise of this culture improves the process of cutting off if you were going to cut people off on either side. To be clear, we agree generally with their characterization. So the recent features of their phenomenon, like people can still cut off, but it's about the culture, it's about the rise. So more and more people doing it. It's about having social recognition for this phenomenon and having public discussions on red flags and healthy boundaries for yourself. I have 4 responses to the government team. The first response is when they say, you do this as a last resort, to which we say it is impossible as per their setup. You could only use this as a last resort if you know when your threshold is. But if you don't have a public discussion on what your criteria is for that threshold, then you will constantly stay in these abusive relationships. Note that this is also a reason for why their first preemption does not work. People do stay in abusive relationships, even if there are discussions about mental health, because you don't ever know if it applies to you. You need there to be a rise about the cutoff culture to attach that mental health discussion to you. Secondly, they make a broad claim that people will be irrational on our side. We also think people tend to be irrational on government bench for the same reason. So the problem here is that instead of being irrational and tending towards protecting yourself, they are irrational towards self-sacrificing to keep the friendship group alive, but they themselves suffer. Thirdly, we also think that it's justified for them to leave the friend group. The happiness of your friend group is not your responsibility. Your responsibility is towards yourself and keeping yourself healthy. I don't care if your friends are mildly uncomfortable that you're not talking to a person that drains your happiness. Finally, they say, oh, but then awkward and ugly people will worry if they're going to get cut off. The problem is that government bench still distances themselves from people. So the problem is that people will still worry if they're ugly and unhappy because they still might be distanced. The difference is that cutting off and the culture of cutting off is a much clearer signal, so they have less to worry about on our side because there are less ambiguities in the first place. This means that on all accounts already, government bench has lost this debate just on the positive material they've provided. In addition to that, there are two other reasons why opening opposition wins this debate. Number one, people have a hard time cutting people off. Their only point here is the mental health stuff, to which I've already rebutted. Here are three additional structural reasons why it's hard to leave a friendship or a relationship that is toxic. Number one, sunk cost fallacy. Many people simply spend so much time with another person that they feel it is a waste of this relationship to leave, despite the fact that that relationship is a net negative on their lives. Secondly, they're afraid to rock the boat. They're afraid of the uncertainty of finding a person in a new relationship, despite the fact that even nobody would be better than with this toxic person. Thirdly and finally is that there are many external social norms that disproportionately harm vulnerable people for leaving. Like when relationships have expectations on women to be more obedient and make them look disloyal when they're the first ones to leave. This is why the problem with Gov's framing is that there's still a very large group of people whom are trapped in these relationships all around the world that never get any solace. Why is this culture incredibly good? It acts as a counterbalance in three ways. Number one, it's a massive jolt that can push you to recognize when a relationship is actually bad in the first place. They assume that just because people know abuse exists doesn't mean they make the connection to the abuse that exists in their lives right now. We give them examples. We give them these public discussions for healthy boundaries. Secondly, we give them the self-righteousness to believe that they are justified in cutting this person off, which takes away the feelings of shame and stigma that make up the main impediment to you cutting them off in the first place. Finally, we also give them the hope of a future. They can spend time deepening their relationships with non-toxic friends. It frees up their mental bandwidth to focus on making new friends, which means they're less afraid. This means that a very large portion of people that were previously abused, now using this culture, can speak their truth and leave these awful relationships. In addition to this argument also has two additional reasons it's incredibly valuable. One, even if it doesn't activate that often, it creates a structural incentive for abusers and bad people to not be toxic in the first place because they fear or they feel like this person might leave them and know that they're a bad person. This means that either one, they preemptively act less bad, or two, when people call them out for being toxic and leave, they become less bad because they know that they're abusers in the first place. The second weighing point is that you can also leave before it gets too entrenched. If you leave on either side and the only difference is timeline, the problem is that on government bench, they leave too late. They leave after they've had a kid. They leave after they've built a home together and paid that property off, which means on Gov, there are massive traumas, whether it be economically, not being able to make food on the table, having to live with a kid that you don't love anymore, having to be divorced. All of these things are incredibly traumatizing. We'd rather you leave early. This first argument crushes them by dealing with an incredibly vulnerable group of the population, which is also quite large, whom we now save. I'll take a POI from closing government.
Right, so we think that the people that are most likely to use this are probably those who already have inflated sense of self-esteem in the first place. Why are those people who are most vulnerable to abuse the ones that are going to be the majority users of this mentality?
So you say that, but opening government's framing is that it tends to be done by people, that group of people would already leave anyway. So I think you're kind of shafting the OG framing. Okay, argument 2. The rise of the culture also improves the process of cutting people off. The problem is that in status quo, there are pre-existing problems with the process of cutting someone off. There are 3. Number 1, you're shamed for doing it because you're seen as weak-willed, you're seen as disloyal, you're seen as a bad friend. Secondly, you do it poorly because you don't think about it until the resentment has built up, and then you do it in a destructive and explosive way that leads with insults, that leads to trauma. Number 3, you often do it rashly or without knowing the repercussions, and you do it in a time of extreme emotional turmoil because this is the first time you thought about it. So this is not a debate about cutting people off more or less like what OG thinks it is. It is a debate about the culture and the discussions around that culture. So this is a debate about people who leave anyways. This is a debate about how rational you are, because OG still deals with that irrationality. What happens on our side is you have that culture to act as a guide and a role model to prevent people from being as terrible in that process. In fact, in 2 ways. Number 1, because there are so many people doing it, it massively reduces the stigma and shame you feel for doing a decision you would have done anyway. Which means if you were going to do it anyway, we'd rather the abuse victims not be seen as disloyal and awful people on our side of the bench, which means that if you reduce a substantial amount of harm to a vulnerable group of people, the Gov has no answer for it. Secondly, though, is that it also makes you think about this decision long before you actually have to do it, which means, one, there's a lot less dread and anxiety coming up. Two, when you do it, you're not shouting and hurling insults at one another. You can actually still remain friends afterwards, and you can have that distancing process that OG wants in the first place. But thirdly, is that you have the capacity to do it well. You have the language to articulate your concerns in the first place so that you can even call them toxic to begin with. The way up of this is quite simple. If you were going to cut them off anyway, we'd rather have that cutting off process be deliberate, rational, and one that doesn't traumatize you for years to come because it was so explosive that it ended up with you hating each other at the end of it. Beyond that, this is a massive source of strain and damage, which we prevent an opening opposition, and that's why we win this debate. Oppose.
Thank the speaker for that fine speech. May we now have the Deputy Prime Minister extend the open case.
POIs in chat. Opening opposition has a clever strategy. They claim that if people are going to cut off people from their lives anyways, it's better that they know where the threshold is and they know how to do it responsibly. We agree with this claim. However, in order for this argument to work, opening opposition needs to characterize why these platforms are likely to build in such a way that they encourage reasonable discussions about thresholds and how to do this properly. Notice, panel, that OO gave you zero structural reasons as to why this will be done well and responsibly when it comes to the discourse online, which had to compete with Paula's competing analysis as to why this is done negatively. I think that if DLO tries to backload this, it's first of all kind of unfair against the format, but it's a huge strategic gap in opening opposition. I will expand on the framing as to why the online influencers who promote cutoff culture do not have the incentives to encourage a reasonable way to instruct their people to do this. First of all, note that the birthplace of this culture is the West, most specifically Western individualism, the idea of indulgence culture. It's if something feels good to you, you should do it. Note that this intersects with other ideologies such as girl boss feminism, that you should always prioritize slaying and stuff like that, or on the other side of the political spectrum, the red pill, that life should be about the maximization of your own resources and that you should instrumentalize other people as much as possible. But note that the way these influencers gain attention is by competing with the other people who try to peddle to you the same content. What this means is that to be relevant, they need to inquire or they need to expand into new situations in which you can cut some people off. So at the beginning, or even in the status quo, people might know that if someone is really toxic to you, they should be cut off. But since you need to constantly compete for content, you're going to find new niches and situations where people will be cut off. Even if someone is marginally draining or has bad vibes, that's not good enough for you. Secondly, there's a culture of sharing this with friends or gossiping, because this needs to be an entertaining event in order for it to be shared on social media. So not only do you distance yourself from someone, you make it a spectacle. You share screenshots in group chats, you publicly ridicule that individual. Thirdly, it involves other people within a cancel culture-like moment where you force others to take a stand, even if they individually want to continue hanging out with that person. Now it's okay to make a choice because you turn it into a moral crusade. So on OO's metric about you wanting to make your own choice based on what suits you, Paula's analysis already defeats this, and this got zero analysis. Thirdly, you make it a declaration to the person themselves because this is seen as a way to gain your autonomy and to gain your empowerment. This actually leads to the same harm that opening opposition is trying to avoid, of having rash confrontations. Because if on their side of the house, it is true that you don't want a confrontation, that you don't want social shaming, it's totally fine to just stop gradually responding to the person as much, to not go out with them as much. If they are violent, if they are likely going to use abusive methods against you, such as manipulating you or gaslighting you, if you have a violent confrontation with them, or not a violent confrontation with them, but a bombastic confrontation with them, when you tell them they are a bad person and you want them out of your life, they're likely to retaliate. But if you are the bad guy in that situation, then you're likely to make them feel really bad and really shitty. But I would like to note the situations in which this happens and why actually this will not then be done in a responsible way. Note that the situations in which you're likely to find a red flag are when people have a mental health crisis, because you likely had a good relationship with a person in the past if you wanted to be a friend with them, and now it's changing, which means that probably a a person is going through a bad time. They're not responding to messages as much. They may be more emotional or lash out at you more, but note that since you had a good relationship with them in the past, it's likely that this can be fixed. But Paula gives you crucial analysis as to why this culture prevents you from fixing these relationships, because you want that moment of instant gratification right now, especially in the time of social media, when we're talking about young people who are not emotionally mature enough, when one conflict, when one confrontation might seem like the end of the world. In the counterfactual, you might first talk to them more slowly, so you get the approval of your friends, so that you have this moment of catharsis like your favorite social media influencer, which means you're likely to do it in an irrational way, to the opposite of what opening opposition wants. Secondly, and I hinted at this before, you want to involve other friends as well, because this is connected with cancel culture. This looks like people going to other people and saying, you have to cancel this person, otherwise you're not virtuous, which is especially bad for people who are unpopular, because note, in most conflicts, there is no clear-cut good guy or bad guy, but one person has more social capital, one person makes more clout, has more clout, which means that people who are vulnerable, who might actually be in the right, but may not have enough social skills to fight it, or may not have more connections, can be completely ostracized. And note, panel, being abandoned by your friends is shitty, because we are relational human animals. We base our self-worth as to how others perceive us. It might be bad enough if people slowly distance themselves from us, but if people completely tell us that we are not worth their time, that we are a bad guy, and all of our social circle will abandon us, this is completely crushing for your self-esteem, and like destroys your ability to form relationships in the future. And I would like to tackle the weighing of opening opposition here, because what they say is, we only have a duty to ourselves, we don't have a duty to other people. But note that in the future, you might rely on other people as well. Since we characterize that people are short-sighted, they don't understand that if you're assholes to other people and if you cut them out, this might affect you negatively in the long run. The final point I would like to tackle before finishing my speech is on abusive relationships, because I don't think OO tackled with this preemptive enough. Note that if you have an abusive relationship, you get negative feedback from this, and you understand this is your risk to your personal safety, and it might cause huge emotional pain, which means that your friends who otherwise might stigmatize you for leaving someone will not stigmatize you for leaving someone who's extremely abusive. But when it comes to the sunk cost fallacy, note that other social narratives are making abuse really prominent right now in people's minds. First of all, social movements like feminism and child protection movements are telling you what the red flags of abuse are telling you to leave, because that is how they get social capital and donations to build shelters for abused women and stuff like that, but also general mental health awareness. This debate happens along the fringes of people who consume social media culture. This is about millennials who go to Instagram and TikTok to solve their personal drama. These are not responsible platforms where they teach you how to do this well. They teach you how to make yourself a clown. Honk, honk, this is clown world. Don't go to TikTok influencers to solve your personal relationships, OG.
I thank the speaker for that fine speech. Maybe now Deputy Leader of the Opposition to close out top half.
Hello, sorry. Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, I'll take my POIs in the chat from closing. If I haven't called by 5:45, please just and I'll take it. All right, start my speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 things to win the debate for OO. Firstly, cleaning up the debate and talking about what the actual delta of either side is. Secondly, explaining why David's material is debate winning to take out OG material, but also how the unresponded stuff is the most utile thing in this debate. But lastly, the worst case, if we do cut more people off and we live more isolated, individualistic lives, why it's much better off. Firstly, to clean up the debate. OG hinges all of their arguments on assuming that this is a debate about why cutting people off is good or bad, or if the individual should do it more. In reality, this is a debate about the rise and the culture around it. And therefore, this influences people on the individual level, not to cut people off more, but to change their decision-making calculus to be more balanced and fair. They try to say that, oh, there are also social norms that make people more selfish, right? That such as girl boss feminism, or pursuing Epicurean delights, or red pill, just wanting your self-satisfaction or instant gratification. But realize that David proved to you that social norms and biological instincts are definitely much stronger to make people more selfless. And if you don't believe so, then it's definitely the social norm to be more selfless and to hurt yourself. Girl boss feminism is very niche and has no power compared to the normal patriarchal norm, which states that, oh, you should probably be aggressive, and that you have responsibilities to other people, and that you need to observe these responsibilities, or you're not following your gender roles and you're not neutral to the rest of society. Being red-pilled or being Epicurean delights has no comparison to the social pressure of the traditions within your family that you'll be ostracized by the people who are financially dependent of if you dare leave your husband, no matter how abusive he is, simply because that shames the family and makes them look like failures as parents because they didn't help you make the right decisions. In most cases, it is definitely much more stronger on an individual level to be socially overly aware, and that depletes your personal self-worth. But more importantly, even if you don't believe this, we outweigh all of their material by talking about the societal level and how the social recognition that this brings creates the infrastructure and the education necessary to choose wisely when you're going to cut people off, right? Firstly, in terms of how David talked about counseling, red flags information, which basically democratizes professional psychological concepts because, you can monetize it in many ways. It's very trendy to talk about online. And so it's not just forums of people self-diagnosing and treating each other. You also have people moving into, influencers moving in with their professional advice on the matter, on what red flags really are, which also teaches you not to immediately leave a relationship, but only to leave a relationship when this red flag really is that bad. You can make your own mental calculus at the end of the day. But even if it's not democratizing professional information, in the worst case, where it's just online discourse, 3 reasons why these platforms build better and reasonable discussions, even if it's just online. Firstly, online discourse, you have to talk about very personal things, which means it'll look very bad if you over-exaggerate it. Look at how there is still an accountability mechanism, and people don't just believe the people asking for advice online. Like, look at am I the asshole, right? On Reddit, for example. They will still tell you sometimes that you are the one being toxic, and then these are the problems with your partner, and you should work it out from there. But secondly, there are incentives to be careful, specifically because of your cancel culture you want to talk about, right? In reality, cancel culture is just a very loud minority of cases. But most of the time, as David proved to you, online discourse is good accountability mechanisms for genuinely abusive people, right? If you are trying to just cancel someone without basis, then obviously other people can corroborate the story based on how they saw your information, your relationship in the past. And therefore, since there's, you're also scared yourself of getting canceled, you won't just lash out and, just try to ruin someone's life without basis. Obviously, though, if you're canceling someone that really does deserve it, then obviously they're an abuser and a horrible individual, and we should cancel them. But lastly, it's not just about YouTubers, but in these discussions, outside the online space, it's also your friends and family giving you advice because they want to help you, and they're more willing to support you and realize your individual self-worth, and never mind the social traditional ostracization they might receive, they'll still likely support you regardless. Just to preempt CG and to take out the whole point about abusers at the end of the day. Because government tries to assert that, egoistic people or abusive people are the ones who take advantage of this norm at the end of the day. The reality is that abusers will always do something abusive at the end of the day, right? They will always try to spin their narrative. Like, for example, if they're a toxic masculine guy, then they're probably more, and they're egoistic, they're probably better at articulating themselves already, and they already have the power structures on their side to try to gaslight people into saying that, oh, I was the good one in the relationship, other people were the bad ones in the relationship. And therefore, they will cut you off regardless, right? The delta in this debate then is how victims respond to this, and we've already proven to you why the victims will respond in much better ways, and that the rest of society will help victims out a lot more at the end of the day. But in the worst case, right, we tell you that abusers are prone to doing something much worse than just leaving you, right? At the end of the day, we'd rather have some people completely cut you off than perpetuate cycles of abuse. Listen to what they talk to you about. You will still be dependent on other people for 2 times a month, or perhaps you're still financially intertwined with them. This allows abusers to not leave you, but they still hold you in their death grasp and can blackmail you and use the bedroom politics in the relationship, basically make your life so much worse. POI.
Which one?
CG.
Okay, so in the cases that you bring up, the very reason why you say patriarchal society expects people to stay in these relationships is that they have a lack of alternative, such as being reliant on this person. So how does cutoff culture make them able to get out of that?
This brings me to why David's material is so debate-winning. So what he told you is that, firstly, you won't be so deeply entrenched in toxic relationships to begin with. We preemptively solve all of their problems because when you're more cautious on choosing a partner and you are sensitive to red flags, then yeah, you won't even just entrench yourself with a spouse and become financially dependent on them, right? You won't stay in these relationships when you're losing so much more for yourself, and you don't have to worry about having no friends. You also create the support structures, maybe for abused people to come together, and then you can create new friend groups from there. You can find commonality in the fact that you're both burned by this common abuse and then help each other and be positive for each other. This is why we defend the worst case. Even if we cut more people off, why is this good? Firstly, because it's healthier for everyone involved. You are in less relationships, and therefore you can deepen the existing relationships that you have, and you can have quality emotional support instead of the fickle, fake friends that you have on government. But secondly, you are more independent. Just as I've hinted about and as David hinted about, we told you that you are less financially dependent on other people, right? Because you know that you can always lose this relationship, and so you're never so emotionally attached to them, and you don't need their affirmation at all times. You be confident in yourself and seek support for yourself. But secondly, again, for gender minorities and for women, for example, you don't have to worry about your spouse being abusive or your parents cutting you off, and you seek self-empowerment so that you don't have to worry about that. Oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of the Opposition for that fine speech. May we now have a member of Gov make a case for the closing Gov.
Okay, I use he, him pronouns and POI in the chat. If I ignore you for a long time, then you can try verbally. Okay. So I'm just going to get started in 3, 2, 1. On the ability to form relationships, we think that closing government is going to be able to take this debate. We think that the quality of relationships in our world is going to look significantly better. And we think that on the net, if you can't reduce the overall amount of abuse, then opening opposition cannot win this debate. So I want to point out a few things, right? Opening opposition tells us that you can leave abusive relationships easier because you're encouraged to do so. We say that first off, this does not happen for people who are in extremely vulnerable positions, which is the group of people that they want to help in the first place. This is because cutoff culture does not give you the tools that you need to get out of a situation where, for example, you are reliant on this person for financial support, where, for example, your family sides with another member of the family, and then you would be seen as an enemy of the family if you chose to disregard that person, if you chose to actively, publicly call them out and cut them off, right? So we think that the people who are in the most vulnerable positions do not get helped by opening opposition, except for their response to me at POI, where they basically are saying that you should just not form deep and interconnected relationships in the first place, and that you should cut people off early on in order to avoid getting into situations where you are vulnerable. We think that this is an absolutely terrible proposition for the human society, and this is the kind of thing that results in why relationships as a whole deteriorate under cutoff culture world, right? Because we have deep trust issues where we assume that other people's red flags are more important than our own red flags, right? So even though we would like people to forgive minor issues in our personality, such as, for example, our mental issues, our mental health issues, our lack of willingness to contact people, whatever it is, they do not have any forgiveness for those things, which means that they cut people off at early points in their relationship where they could lead to deep and meaningful relationships, where they could create closure, where they could create healing. They instead opt to simply choose the selfish outlet of going for a like less toxic relationship. So I want to say, what do these less toxic relationships look like? First off, I want to establish that people who are most likely to make use of cutoff culture are the people who are most narcissistic to begin with. These are the people who already follow loads and loads of channels and things that affirm their own self-worth, their own self-value. Opening government already gave you a great case as to why the people that we see nowadays are damn entitled as to what they can get out of relationships, right? So we think that the people who are very vulnerable and likely to give other people the benefit of the doubt are less likely to make use of cutoff culture. I think opening opposition debates this entire debate from the perspective of a victim without ever recognizing that we are all perpetrators of toxicity and abuse as well as being victims, right? They have no reason why it's more likely that an abuser would like not use cutoff culture or would not do these things, but then the victims in their own positions would. So I think that the people who are most likely to use this are people who are, for example, narcissistic, where the process of narcissism and meeting a partner involves finding someone who feeds your ego and your self-esteem, taking as much as you can from them, getting them to love you as much as possible. And when they do something that does not affirm your identity, you cut them off and you leave them in a position where they are confused, where they are hurt, where they lack closure, where they don't know how to move on. And then you find someone else who is quote unquote less toxic because there's someone who is easier to affirm your identity. We think introspection is the key to being able to reduce these kinds of things happening in the first place. So we need to be able to say, am I the problem? And I know that this is a mentality that can lead to victim blaming, but it also can lead to a lot of self-growth, right? We need to be able to say, like, for example, you might want to cut off your friend because they disappointed you. And the reason they disappointed you is not because of something fundamentally evil about them. It's because you had put them on a pedestal where you assumed this person is great, this person is amazing, this person can always be there for me. And then when they disappoint you, when they let you down, you feel hurt by that. And your automatic reaction to being hurt starts to become, in cutoff culture, you become more and more familiar with the idea of this person causes me pain, this person causes me discomfort, therefore I want them out of my life. We think that it can take place. This is not like knifing OG. We're not saying that like every form of cutoff is like a small case, right? It can take place in loud, like public declarations that this person is terrible, and it can also take place in saying like, okay, I'm no longer going to be friends with these people. I'm being encouraged to just cut people out of my life. Yes, opening opposition.
Abusers don't need to use cutout culture because their own ego and selfishness, plus other patriarchal norms, already let them cut people off. The delta is victims and their ability to diagnose when you need to cut someone off, prepare to be self-sustaining before you cut someone off, and form better relationships after you cut.
So here's the problem that you lack on opening opposition is you think that abusers are a binary where we have normal people and we have abusers. We think that even completely like quote unquote normal people are perfectly capable of being toxic and of being abusive and of causing destruction and harm to other people. Right? We think in the context of like specifically abusive people, opening opposition doesn't solve anything because they're just saying that like, okay, I have the self-esteem because of cutoff culture to cut this abusive person off. Well, all that abusive person is going to do is then move on to find someone who has lower self-esteem to take advantage of and continue that harm, right? That cycle of harm is never ended on opposition, and it only gets worse, right? Because the thing is that they say that this forms as like a self-checking mechanism where like abusers are less likely to be abused because they're afraid that you're going to cut them off. No, abusive behavior is actually increased in a world because we can't trust people and we become more paranoid, and we have these issues where we assume like, okay, wait, is this person going to leave me? We have fear of abandonment, right? And so fear of abandonment is often the greatest thing which drives people to be possessive and drives people to want to always know where you're going, who you're hanging out with, etc., right? We think that to the extent that you often, that like ordinary people can use things that are perfectly normal to then think of them as red flags. Like, okay, your boyfriend is going out meeting girls and having chats with them. Oh, he must be like cheating on you. Instead of the fact that he might just be forming perfectly healthy platonic relationships with people of the opposite gender, you are now likely to assume, and we think that a lot of this is also existing on opening government's framework of like why it is that like the kind of messaging of this is not always going to be perfect. It's often coming from influencers, is often being consumed by people who have a inherent bias to assume that they are the ones who are in the right? This is like everybody. We have an inherent bias to usually assume that our version of reality is the correct one, right? So we're very likely to assume that someone else's behavior is toxic and is like a red flag insofar as it's something that doesn't satisfy us and doesn't make us happy in that relationship. Therefore, we think that abuse, so why is it that we ultimately think abuse is actually getting worse, right? So we think that you are not only perpetrating a form of harm on those people, we think that the people who are cut off and you are both harmed, right? Because you lack introspection. You never had to close or resolve or figure out how you could go over these issues. You just took an easy way out. We think that this means that you're very likely to end up getting into similar relationships because you never solved the problem in the first place that might have originated from you. It might have been your lack of ability to resolve conflicts, for example, that allowed communication to get so poor in your relationship. We think that also it causes harm to that person, right? Look to the fact that divorced men are 10 times as likely to commit suicide, right? We think that to the extent you cut people off at a very vulnerable part in their life where they might absolutely need this kind of thing, you encourage them to self-harm. You also encourage backlash and angry reactions, right? So like if you cut off a member of your family, it's very possible that person will try to mobilize the family against you instead of if you were to quiet quit the relationship where you were able to just sort of coexist, right? Similarly, you cut off a divorced partner, that person might stalk you, might cause harm to you. We think that you lack the support systems then when you are in that patriarchal context, and then we have more things to say, but you use time badly, so I'm sorry.
Thank the speaker for that fine speech. Maybe now have a member proposition, make the case for closing up.
Hi, can I check that I'm audible?
Yep, you are audible.
All right, thank you. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. The power to put a full stop in relationships that were no longer meaningful to you or harmed you was always crucial in this debate. And we support here that the toxic or like inherently shitty in the first place. And I think the bulk of the relationships that they might talk about should already have been cut off in the first place, already inherently toxic in the first place. People who ostracize other individuals on the principle of them being ugly or not good enough is already inherently toxic, showing that the relationship already has soured. So a few points of characterization here. Firstly, the process of making friends, I'd like to highlight again, takes years of effort, and a lot of the times there are many years that are put into the relationship. That means that the relationship is unlikely to be cut off in a once-off fashion, and it's likely going to be the case where it's an extended period of time, showing that there's already an indication of toxicity over accumulation of multiple events. Secondly, the rise of the cut-off culture looks already like ceasing contact with people who are harming you, your state of mind, or you no longer find meaningful. This is opposed to the traditional narrative that you should be unconditionally loving to your husband or to your parent. So this is stance that's inherently empowering. So on to point of contention. Firstly, I'd like to deal with Qi's argument about the what if, about keeping hope alive to that maybe after you resolve this, there's going to be a meaningful relationship that's possible if you didn't cut it off. We think that this is an inherently risky and dangerous mindset for a couple of reasons. One, the very mindset is what actually leads to abusive relationships in the first place, because there's a false hope that if you don't cut off, that if you continue and dedicate time and effort to it, to your spouse, it won't be abusive. And that is inherently harmful at the point in which you decide to give up your chances of escape to a false hope until it is too late, and at the point in which you can't opt out of the relationship anymore. Second, the potential for toxicity in the relationship already outweighs a lot of the benefits that side government claims that about the potential of a meaningful relationship blossoming out of this after you recover from this one-time conflict. We think that on opposition, on CO, you will never take that chance, because at the point in which it risks your mental health, it risks your own life, you will decide to cut off either ways, because the benefits of having a free life of freedom as opposed to the potential for abuse is much higher on our side of the house. Second point on toxic relationships, to just close this off once and for all, we think that distancing inherently never works. At a point in which toxic individuals get desperate at that point when you try to distance yourself from them, and that deals with government's frame. And this is due to the inherent psychology of power hierarchies, right? Because at the point in which you take a soft stance, people get desperate, and abuse inherently gets worse. And the reality that government tries to push, that people can't cut off because of family or finance, is already mitigated at the point in which the rise of the cut-off culture already builds support systems that are crucial for these individuals to opt out of relationships that are already toxic in the first place. Now, onto my positive material. Firstly, on healthy relationships, and second, on socially, on how you get better mental and social health at the point in which you are able to opt out of relationships. And this is an entirely new dimension to the debate and applies across the board to all individuals inherently. And firstly, on healthy relationships, on people know their boundaries, and this inherently clashes with closing government's fear of abandonment point, because at the point in which, on the flip side, stalking people or accusing people of toxicity already indicates the presence of toxic relationships that should already be cut off in the first place. So what boundaries incur or what the cutoff relationship actually looks like is what the people actually having boundaries and having mutual respect because of their standards that are set, because they're clear standards that are people are widely aware of, that there should be a bar to which relationships are held at, and people know when the relationship turns toxic, and hence there is a clear standard for which relationships can be cut off and there is no fear of abandonment there. And second point on socially healthy relationships, this is an entirely new dimension to this debate, because the frame here is that society is inherently connected, and we believe that this is the case for two structural reasons. Firstly, the advent of social media and structure of society perpetuates interconnectedness, and secondly, pre-existing social pressures. There is a pre-existing social pressure to actually maintain acquaintances in a society of today. But before I continue, Oshi. Sorry, I can't hear you.
People are libertarian. People side with the popular person who says they're the victim, even if they're the toxic one. In patriarchal societies, queer people and promiscuous women would be cut off because the popular people with clout are those who hate queer people and women. You have no accountability.
We don't think that the society will exist to such an extreme case, because like social media already perpetuates allows people to have their own voice on like forums and Reddit platforms, and additionally society has moved in such a direction that actually benefits and actually favors the lived experiences and the stories of people of minorities. Hence, this point is entirely flipped at the point in which people in minority society has given them the power to actually share their stories and actually balance the playing field against the patriarchal network because of the liberal wave, because of people actually paying more attention to these scenarios. Hence, that point is flipped. And okay, on to my continuing my point on socially healthy relationships. It is hence crucial that the advent of the cut-off culture frees people from the obligation to maintain relationships that are no longer meaningful to them. What does this look like? Like your acquaintances, people you meet at work, etc. You maintain this large interconnected network, and on comparative and government, you have no way to actually free yourself from those emotionally draining relationships that you don't actually want to dedicate time and energy to. Because on the flip side, you're forced to maintain a relationship because of traditional ideologies that is rude or is not good, to actually cut yourself off from acquaintances because there's an obligation to maintain that. So why would a cut-off be far more palatable on site government? Two structural reasons, or one structural reason, in fact. So the very fact that there's a mutual understanding because of the awareness about the movement, because of the rise of the movement, ensures that the cut-off from like acquaintances and people who you no longer find meaningful to have relationships with is inherently going to be much more mutual. The other individual also finds that there's no longer any meaning. So there's no longer any sort of tension, any sort of obligation to continue a relationship that's no longer beneficial to you. The two impacts that are important here is, firstly, it's less socially draining to you to actually maintain a large social circle. And secondly, you're able to dedicate time and energy to family, to things that are important to you, the people who are close to you. So by virtue of the fact that you have more time, more energy to dedicate to people who are closer to you, actually even benefits toxic relationships or like conflicts in family, or conflicts with your peers, or with your parents, with your spouse, from actually forming in the first place, because of the fact that you have more time and more energy to dedicate towards them. Because for all these reasons, please stand on side opposition, because the cut-off culture benefits and empowers individuals. Thank you.
Thanks for that fine speech. Maybe now have the whip close the case for CG.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll be taking verbal POIs. I will not be looking at the chat. Likely I'll try to take a point between 4 and 5, or like 4 and 6. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. A woman in conservative society don't have the luxury to build healthier relationships via discussions and call-outs. OO tells you cutting off is beneficial because it allows for domestic abuse victims to escape, changing norms on taboos, allows for support system to like be formed via discussion. MO essentially echoes this, saying that, okay, we're in a more liberal society now, so I'll be dealing with both op case like integratedly. Firstly, we think that it's hard to leave abusive relationship in marriages as is. You get entangled because like within it because of assets, children, like yada yada, like etc. Of which will like continue to be things that ties you and your abuser together. So it's not that easy to leave them in the first place. And like likely victims are like very dependent on their abuser for like financial factors and such. So if in like status quo, norms are conservative, it is less likely that you will be able to form like a support system because of taboos, right? Like for example, like the framing the like people would just tell you that you are now a divorced woman, you don't have a man to rely on, like you essentially becomes a societal outcast, right? I don't think that MO's like or CO's case was deal with this effectively, because I think that their entire case is very contingent upon just like the characterization that society are just liberal now and everything should fly, right? Like therefore like be it's like if you have that taboo or stigma like being pointed at you, essentially you become like a societal outcast. Your family members are less likely to actually support you, and the comparative here that we give you is that like there's like the alternative here is quiet quitting, in insofar as you can actually lower your expectation for people but still keep in contact. And we think that this is a safer way for victims of abuse to actually transition out of this period, right? This is the unique extension from OG that we give. Like we allow for the space for boundaries can actually happen when people can be amongst like people like other people where they feel safe, right? Discussions is more likely to happen thanks to like quiet quitting in like conservative society, right? So for example, on opsite, it actually looks like you can take your child and yourself moving into like a relative home for like longer, like on our side, it looks like you can take your child and yourself moving into a relative's home for like longer duration than previously allowed and controlled for. I don't think that this can happen on offsite, right? The only option is that you will just like cut off and like lose your financial dependency. They've never provided reasons on how they can like transition out of this in transition through this period, right? This degree of control is is essentially like it's characteristic of like a toxic like abusive relationship, right? I think that the margin of change here, that you are more likely to have safety net while like transitioning out of the toxic relationship and actually have time to like foster relationship outside of your toxic husband, right? And get people on your side. I think it's more likely to happen if you actually live in a conservative society where people around you will be more likely to believe you, that like they can believe that you are the role model of like the norms to begin with, right? If people around you are more likely to outcast a divorcee first before they're going to form healthy discussion with you to understand where you're coming from. I think that the way that OO deals with this is like problematic because it goes back to their claims on that relationship will be better off because of discussion, and that all relationships are healthy, so like they won't be shouting at people when like they cut off, then when the cut off happened, and like you can actually articulate your concern. I think the cycle of harms never really ended on offside. OO's material assumes that people don't cut each other off for breakfast, which is true insofar as not dealing with the issue makes it likely that you will go back into like relationship even after you cut somebody off, or at best that you will continue to form relationships, but that you enter a new relationship mimicking the same abusive tendencies. Abuse actually gets worse, I think, on offside. And Seth also tells you that it's because of the lack of adjustment in expectation. You actually put people on a pedestal comparatively. More discussions can happen on outside because of expectation adjustments and norm conformity, leading to like effective safety net being built. We get the prerequisite conditions for less abusive relationships to occur on outside, and for that to actually change, right? CG tells you, before I move on, I want to take a point.
Quiet quitting maintains dependence and keeps you vulnerable to blackmail with no support from society. We need to make abusers more afraid of accountability and teach victims to prepare for a clean break and more selective good relationships.
Yeah, but you have never proved like why, like how you would actually prepare victims for that clean break to begin with, right? Clean break will not really happen on outside because of all of the reasons that I've just said, and I've also told you, and I've also told you like why is it that it's less likely that like any a sense of safety net will actually happen to protect the victim during that transition period, like so that they get to a point where they can actually clean break, like have that clean break with the like the abuser and escape that relationship to begin with. Safety net doesn't really occur on your side, I don't think. And I think that overall CG tells you like exclusively that if people are already at a point where they have to cut off, they likely already are sorry, I lost track of my time. Yeah, they likely already are at like a very bad place with each other, and I think it's extremely unlikely that they will be able to cut off like their abuser in like a holistic way, as per OO's like claimed benefits, right? I think that like humans are essentially like emotional creatures, and this is like very and it's very unrealistic to achieve because like of all the trauma and all of the abuse that you went through. You have like a lot of PTSD probably come like, and things that you like, that these are things that probably takes a lot of time to like to deal with, and it's very unrealistic to expect that these like that abuse victims would just immediately come to a resolution, or to be able to like practice articulation and resolution dealing with their abusers, and practice articulation with their abusers to like and like to clean cut to begin with, when you actually don't really are able to provide them any sense of like safety net in transitioning out of it, or the prerequisite conditions to transition out, right? I think it takes time for like boundaries and healthy communication to be set, which is I think CG's exclusive benefits here that we tell you. Like on CG, we tell you how allowing for space and boundaries to be set around the functionality and lifestyle of the domestic abuse survivors, right? Yeah, for that, vote CG.
Thank the speaker for that fine speech. May we now have the opposition whip in this debate as a whole.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Just like the relationships discussed within this debate is incredibly messy. And so as opposition whip, I will tie this debate up together and clear very clearly. First, frame contest, right? Side closing government makes this assumption that people who are the most narcissistic individuals would make use of this culture and narrative, but this is completely untrue because they're so far off into their own heads that they're always going to cut off people in the first place. This cut-off culture actually inherently allows people who are less narcissistic, who are very self-doubtful, to be pushed towards the direction of cutting friends off who are not good for them, right? And so moving on, right? 3 clashes for the house today. First clash on rationality, second clash on toxicity, and third clash on maintaining friendships, right? So on to the first clash, but before that, actually, let's talk about the tools that this culture allows you to have, right? The entirety of government bench have doubted the tools that this culture is able to give you, saying that, oh, like there are no alternatives in the first place. We like to disprove that idea. Okay, OO gave you the idea that this culture gives you the ability for education, right? But we tell you that although that is true, that is not enough, right? Because they limited that education only towards in social media, but have completely failed to talk about any of the real ways that this culture will manifest. For example, your parents telling you that it's okay to cut your friends off if it's toxic, or within classrooms and educational facilities. Those are much more stronger places and strongholds in which education and narrative can actually manifest as compared to your TikTok influencers, right? Okay. And secondly, what tools does this culture actually bring about for you, right? They say that there's no alternative, but we tell you that that's not true. Other than the fact that there are support structures that can be created, right? These alternatives are always blocked by societal narratives, right? So if you cut someone off and you become a divorced woman, right? The reason why there's no alternatives is because future employers will see you as a divorced woman and is not willing to employ you in the first place. And so if that societal narrative is able to be changed by the fact that cut-off culture is now normalized due to the rise, then these people actually unlock an alternative whereby they are able to become independent in their own way without relying upon toxic abusers, right? Okay, and so now on to the first clash about rationality. Side opening government claim that people will disregard friendships irrationally, right? This point has been dead since the very, very beginning. Okay, my previous speaker already told you how years of relationship cannot be destroyed within a few seconds, and that most people already understand that simple accidents happen and that sometimes people make mistakes, right? What they needed to show was why that moment of conflict would create such an immense amount of irrationality, but that was not proven, and hence this burden is not proven in the first place, right? Okay, side closing government said that, oh, this will impede self-reflection, right? But this is not true, right? Because for the people who are going to be cutting friends off, again, we're talking about people who will self-doubt, the people who are doubtful of themselves and not that confident, right? These people will only know that as an option. How would knowing being able to cut people off and getting the support actually allow you to just cut off people randomly? No, you still go through the exact same phase of self-doubt. It's just that the goalpost is not shift and that people do not have a false hope that the relationship will get better, right? And so what we tell you is that because of the education that comes about from this culture, right, actually people will become much more rational, right? And not only does that allow for what opening opposition said, which is that relationships will end in a less destructive way, but also that relationships are able to be continuously maintained, right? And what we tell you, so opening government, right, said that, oh, it's going to become a spectacle, that cancel culture is a bad thing, and that it's going to be cloud-based, right? We tell you that firstly, this is extreme contradiction. Why is that the case, right? If cancel culture really exists, if backlash really exists, then breaking relationships a spectacle is going to be inherently harmful towards you, because people look at evidence. People don't just listen to cloud. People look at screenshots, people look at evidence of toxicity within relationships to determine if you are actually a victim. And so spectacles won't happen because, simply put, cancel culture does exist, but it's not cloud-based, but evidence-based, right? And if an individual is toxic, we tell you that it's good that people leave them in the first place, all right? And now, secondly, after that, right, we tell you what's the biggest downfall of OO. OO brought to you a lot of positive material and mechanization, but they failed to deal with the counterfactual that the government side has brought to us, right? Their counterfactual is that people can slowly distance themselves away from abusers and friends. This is inherently problematic in so many ways. Firstly, people get desperate, especially toxic individuals, right? When people slowly distance themselves from you, as the closing government whip said himself, there's this fear of abandonment, and you allow for that to manifest and build up because people slowly distance themselves away from you. So you become desperate and you become much more toxic. That ramping in toxicity allows for that toxicity to become so enthralled and ensnare these victims to the point in which they can't leave the relationships within the first place. And secondly, we tell you that people are able to see it coming. When this culture of cutting people off are normalized, people are able to see it coming and not get so heartbroken by it because they know that that's something that can happen and that there's at least some form of closure for people who are cut off, right? So let's deal with the examples that cite inherently narcissistic that they won't look at the evidence of anything, then it's likely that this relationship will end in the first place, right? And secondly, they raised the example that it allows for people to do self-harm. Does that not sound eerily familiar to what abusers are talking about, right? Abusers saying, if you leave me, I'm going to kill myself. These are the words of an abuser, and so this should not be taken into the realm of a debate because this is exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to avoid in the first place, right? Okay, we tell you that toxic relationships are going to be avoided because people will be able to rely upon the support structure, and that is their friends and family. Fails to actually bring about what is the counter narrative, right? We tell you that the counter narrative on the other side of the house is a society that shuns you, that shames you for leaving a relationship. And that is so incredibly terrible because that means leaving one relationship will leave you isolated from society. And since humans are social creatures, this is incredibly damaging to every single person, right? Social movements are not a good counter narrative that exists, right? Because you're always able to move the goalposts of what abuse actually is, and people will have false hope, as my previous speaker said. What tools does that give you? If the tools that it gives you, right, are the exact same as this culture, then that means this class is a complete wash. And before that, I will take POI.
If you live in a liberal society, patriarchal norms don't exist. If you live in a conservative society, then the cutoff culture will be dictated by conservatives. Since these platforms are majoritarian, most people are irrational, don't look at evidence, and defer to the majority who never engage with this frame.
So this kind of assumption that most people are irrational, do not look at evidence, already point to the lack of intellectual competence that their side of the house have shown. But also that within countries that are more conservative, obviously speaking, this issue will not be completely resolved, but education and more liberal wave stuff that can come into these nations will allow for at least some form of improvement, which is completely unlike the comparative that your side of the house have built up, right? And we tell you that most importantly, we win this debate because of the new substantive that my previous speaker brought to you, which moves me on to my third clash, right? Because simply put, with the advance of social media, you form so many connections that you feel like a shell of a human being, right? And that is incredibly daunting because this applies to everyone. But this has argument that's most width, right? If you talk about things like abuse, those are very niche scenarios, and rationality is just a clash that we completely win. However, looking at a clash upon breaking up acquaintance relationships so that you can focus on current relationships, this allows for you not to spread yourself too thin and that relationships can be properly maintained. And we win this debate based on width because you impact the most amount of people within this alternative in the first place. So what have we brought you? We brought you the fact that toxic relationships need an escape route, and we bring you the fact that we are able to give you that escape route, give these victims the escape route. We tell you that rationality will not be overridden by one moment of conflict like what the other side preposterously claims. And we tell you that most importantly speaking, relationships cannot be broken because you cannot spend the time to actually strengthen those relationships when you're too diverse and spread yourself too thin. And for these reasons, support closing opposition. Thank you.
Right. I thank the speaker for a fine speech that also effectively ends this particular debate. If I could be told when the stream is down, that'd be great. All right. In the meantime, I guess what you guys can do is to step outside of this room and wait around in the main hall. Thank you.
Thanks for the round, everyone.
Thanks
For the round.
Thank you for the round.
Actually, like I guess that the oral adjudication will be also like kind of live streamed. So I think for the discussion, we should use Discord, I guess.
Okay, so just to be clear, I do not consent for the oral adjudication to be live streamed. I'm okay with myself being recorded during the actual debate, but not the oral adjudication.
Oh, I understand. Thank you for the confirmation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, then, yeah. Then we can just have discussion here, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.